The pounding shook my door like a battering ram. Each blow rattled the frame until the lock splintered. Then the door burst open, crashing hard against the wall. In the glow from the hallway light stood Thomas Rourke, my stepfather. His face flushed red with liquor and rage. He staggered forward, shouting through clenched teeth. "You've betrayed this family, Anna. Tonight you'll learn what loyalty costs." Before I could react, his weight slammed into me, shoving me back into the bookshelf. Pain erupted through my shoulder with a sharp, sickening pop. My body folded, ribs screaming as his fist drove into me again. Behind him, half hidden in the dim light, stood my mother, Clara. Her hands covered her face, her body trembling, eyes wide with horror. But she didn't move toward me. She didn't speak. She only stood frozen, watching as I crumpled to the floor. That silence cut deeper than his fists. "My name is Captain Anna Lewis. I am 32 years old, a U.S. Army combat medic stationed at Fort Campbell. I have dragged wounded soldiers from burning trucks under fire, set broken bones on dirt floors, and stitched torn skin beneath desert storms in Afghanistan. I have watched men bleed out in minutes, but nothing in combat ever prepared me for the battle that forced its way through my own door that night." Thomas's hand tangled in my hair, yanking me up, his knuckles smashing into my cheekbone until sparks exploded behind my eyes. My shoulder hung limp, pain screaming with each breath. I tried to resist, but his size overwhelmed mine. The air reeked of whiskey, his voice low and venomous. "You'll never escape me, girl. Family is forever." My mother's muffled sobs broke behind her trembling hands. For a fleeting second our eyes met. I begged silently, "Please help me." But she stayed still, her silence louder than any scream. I remembered the nights when she used to sing me to sleep, her voice wrapping me in safety. That voice was gone now, buried in fear. Blood trickled into my mouth as my knees buckled. But through the haze I spotted the olive-green radio sitting on my desk, the one I carried back from the base after long shifts. Crawling onto my side, I lunged forward, every rib screaming in protest. Thomas's boot slammed hard into my back, but my fingers still found the switch. 3 quick presses. The emergency signal. Miles away, military police would see my coordinates light up. Thomas didn't notice. His rage consumed him. He yanked me up again and hurled me into the wall, swearing I would regret ever leaving his house, his rules. My vision tunneled, light narrowing, sound fading to a dull roar. Yet beneath the thunder of his voice I thought I heard it, the faint crackle of a response from the radio. Hope, fragile as thread, pulsed through me. Even as pain swallowed me whole, I knew this night would not end in silence. It would end with the truth breaking through. When I lay there on the floor, copper filling my mouth, my mind betrayed me by dragging me backward, back to when life still felt safe. Pain has a way of awakening memory. I saw my father again, not in uniform this time, but kneeling on the living room carpet, holding a small flag as I stumbled through the words of the anthem. He laughed softly when I forgot a line, then started again, guiding me with his steady voice. He was a Navy veteran, stern with himself but endlessly kind with me. I thought that steadiness would last forever. But forever ended when I was 8. A sudden heart attack struck him down in the middle of a late shift. And just like that, the man who had taught me courage was gone. The house fell silent, stripped of his laughter and the safety it once carried. My mother, Clara, tried to be both parents at once, but I could see the cracks in her spirit. She went from singing in the kitchen to sitting alone in silence, staring at stacks of bills, her hands trembling when she thought I wasn't looking. It was in those fragile years that Thomas Rourke entered our lives. A former logistics officer, tall and commanding, the kind of man who drew attention the moment he stepped into a room. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who claimed to know discipline and order. To my mother, still grieving and desperate for something steady, he must have looked like salvation. To me, he was a stranger who slipped into our lives far too quickly. I'll never forget that first dinner. Thomas arrived with a bouquet of lilies for my mother, the kind she hadn't been given in years. For me, he brought a stuffed bear dressed in tiny fatigues. My mother's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen since before my father's death, her cheeks flushed with something that looked dangerously close to hope. I remember staring at her smile, radiant, alive again, and knowing I should have felt relief. Instead, a cold knot formed in my chest. That bear sat on my shelf for years, staring with stitched eyes, a reminder that someone new had stepped into the space where my father's memory still lingered. Even as a child, I sensed the gift wasn't about me. It was about claiming territory, planting a flag in the quiet grief that filled our home. And though my mother welcomed him openly, I knew then, in a way words couldn't yet explain, that the light inside our house had shifted. It would never shine the same again. Memory works in strange ways. That night on my apartment floor, with Thomas's fists raining down like hammers, I couldn't stop seeing the earlier version of him, the one the world admired, the one my mother believed in. After my father's death, Thomas had entered our lives cloaked in charm. He spun war stories at the dinner table, polished smooth, never too grim, just impressive enough. He stood tall, always in crisp shirts, his tone measured and calm. When he moved us into his sprawling house in New Jersey, my mother called it a blessing. To the neighbors, he was the perfect gentleman. To my mother, he was safety after years of struggle. But slowly the mask began to slip. It started with little things. Questions about where my mother spent her afternoons, comments about her clothes, remarks disguised as concern. Then came the suggestion she close her bank account, because families should share everything. I watched her surrender her independence with barely a protest. His charm with outsiders never faltered, but inside our walls he rewrote every rule. The woman who once hummed as she cooked no longer sang. The red lipstick she wore on Sundays was tucked into the back of a drawer. Even her footsteps softened, as though the floor itself required permission. One by one her friends disappeared until the phone sat silent. I learned to measure the mood of the house by the silence that pressed against the air. One night when I was 14, I finally saw what lived beneath Thomas's polished surface. My mother had bought a simple dress, cheap, nothing fancy. She wore it to the table, smiling shyly, and for a fleeting moment, I glimpsed the woman she had once been. Thomas's face hardened. Without warning, he hurled his dinner plate against the wall, sauce running down like blood across the pale wallpaper. His roar filled the room. Irresponsible, wasteful, ungrateful. My mother shrank, stammering apologies, promising to return the dress. I sat frozen, staring at the medal that had fallen from the mantel in the chaos. A navy medal that had belonged to my father. Thomas picked it up, sneered, then tossed it to the floor. His voice was ice. Final. I'm the only man in this house now. In that moment, watching my mother bow her head in silence and my father's medal lying tarnished on the carpet, I realized Thomas was never a protector. He was a conqueror, and our home was his territory. The mask had shattered, and the eyes that glared at me across the room were no longer human. They were the eyes of a predator. The night Thomas hurled my father's medal to the floor marked a turning point in me. I understood then that waiting for normal to return was a fantasy. Normal had died with my father. From that night on, I knew if I wanted air to breathe, I'd have to carve it out myself. High school became my battleground. While other kids lingered in hallways or laughed in the cafeteria, I threw myself into marching drills at dawn, endless push-ups, running until my lungs felt like fire. I welcomed all of it. The ache in my muscles was cleaner than the pain of home. Sweat drowned out the echo of Thomas's voice. Discipline became my shield, a rhythm strong enough to push the darkness of that house a little further away, if only for a few hours. It was during those years that I met Leah Martinez. Quick-witted, sharp as glass, the kind of girl who could see through walls of pretense in a single glance. She asked once why I never invited her over. I laughed it off, but she didn't believe me. One evening after practice, I let a piece of the truth slip. Not the whole weight of it, I couldn't, but just enough for her to glimpse the outline of my prison. She never judged, never pried. She simply became the one person I could breathe around. Sometimes survival only needs one witness who knows you aren't crazy, who believes you. At home, the shadows only thickened. My mother became a ghost inside her own body. She moved softly, spoke rarely, her eyes always downcast. When I begged her to fight for herself, she would only whisper, "You don't understand military men, Anna. He's strict, but he loves us. This is just how they are." Each time she said it, something inside me cracked further. She called it love, but I knew the truth. It was fear wearing a mask too heavy to take off. So I made my vow in silence. I promised myself that the moment I left, I would never come back. I would not fade into a ghost like my mother. I would not let Thomas's rules define family. My escape would not be loud, not dramatic. It would be deliberate, disciplined, inevitable. It was going to be steady, disciplined, inevitable. Every push-up, every mile, every drill was one more step toward freedom. And in the stillness of my room at night, with that stuffed bear in uniform staring down from the shelf, I whispered the same promise again and again. I will get out. I will never let him win. Leaving that house felt like stepping out of a cave after years of breathing stale air. When my acceptance letter from West Point arrived, I packed my duffel quietly, not trusting my voice to speak. The morning I left, Thomas barely looked up from his paper. My mother clung to me, her arms trembling, whispering words I couldn't hold on to. I told myself I was free. But freedom is never as simple as distance. At the academy, discipline became something else. Not a shield but a road forward. I poured myself into every drill, every field exercise, every late-night study session until exhaustion became the only rest I knew. Years later, I traded cadet gray for army green and became a combat medic. Afghanistan taught me lessons no classroom ever could. I pressed down on wounds while mortars thundered close enough to rattle the ground. I dragged soldiers twice my size through dust and blood, stitched torn flesh with hands too tired to shake. Out there, survival was measured in seconds, and sometimes in miracles. It was in that desert I met Lieutenant Rachel Kim, sharp-tongued, fearless, the kind of medic who laughed in the face of chaos. She became my anchor in the storm. And then there was Captain Daniel Hayes, Special Forces. He carried himself with quiet strength, a steadiness that reminded me of my father. Over months of missions and nights beneath a foreign sky, I let myself believe I could feel something more than survival. But even halfway across the world, the ghosts followed. Every call home carried the same tremor in my mother's voice. She insisted she was fine, but the pauses between her words said otherwise. Silence has a weight, and hers pressed through every static-filled line. I couldn't bear it, so I mailed her brochures from a military spouse support center. Numbers she could call, safe places she could go. Thomas found them. His rage traveled faster than any bullet. One night my phone buzzed with a message from him. Stay out of my house. If you interfere again, I won't just deal with her. I'll come for you too. Reading those words in a dusty tent lit by a single lantern, I felt the war shift. It wasn't just overseas anymore. It had followed me, clawing across oceans, reminding me that some battles don't end when you leave home. Some shadows cross borders, waiting until you're forced to face them head-on. The threat in Thomas's message lingered at the back of my mind like the constant hum of an engine you can't shut off. I buried myself in work, in the chaos of the field, but some nights the silence of the desert only made his shadow feel louder. Then came the call, the one that broke me more than any wound I'd ever treated on the battlefield. It was late, the camp hushed except for the steady rumble of generators. My sat phone buzzed, and when I answered, all I heard at first was wind and a trembling voice. Anna, my mother whispered as though someone stood close enough to hear. He knows. He smashed the house phone. He said if you ever try again he'll kill you. I clenched the receiver so hard my knuckles turned white. My voice cracked as I begged, Mom, listen to me. Come to the base. I'll arrange clearance. You'll be safe here. I'll protect you. Her breath shook on the other end. I could picture her at some dim payphone on a street corner, glancing over her shoulder. No, baby, she said, her voice breaking like fragile glass. You don't understand. He always finds us. Always. You have to live, Anna. Just you. That's enough for me. And then the line went dead, leaving only static. A hollow silence that felt like the world closing its doors. I sat there in the tent, staring at the shadows moving across canvas walls, feeling like the little girl clutching a stuffed bear all over again, helpless, unseen. But training doesn't allow helplessness for long. The next morning I sought out Major Jonathan Reed, our Judge Advocate General Officer. He was a man who weighed every word, the kind whose calm presence made you believe in rules even in chaos. I told him everything, my mother's call, Thomas's threats, the history that had stalked me across continents. His jaw tightened but his eyes stayed steady. He promised to look into what could be done legally, though even he admitted military law's reach was limited when it came to a civilian stepfather back home. Later in the medic tent I found Rachel. She listened quietly without a single interruption, then gripped my shoulder with the kind of force that said she had already decided. If Thomas came, she would stand in his way too. That night I lay awake beneath the foreign stars, realizing the cruel truth. Hope had flickered for a moment, only to be snuffed out by my mother's fear. But fear cuts both ways. Thomas thought he had silenced her. What he didn't realize was that her words had ignited something in me instead. A refusal to remain his prisoner even from half a world away. The night ended with red and blue lights flashing against the rain-soaked windows of my quarters. The sound of boots thundered through the hallway, and Thomas's hands were finally torn away from me. He was still shouting as they dragged him out, still spitting rage even as the cuffs cut into his wrists. The air reeked of alcohol and iron, my blood still smeared across his skin. I sat slumped against the wall, chest heaving, ribs aching with every breath, and watched the storm inside our home finally break. But what struck me most wasn't his capture. It was my mother. Clara stood frozen in the corner, mascara streaked down her face, her body trembling. She hadn't lifted a hand to stop him. Even when the MPs shoved Thomas into the hall, she only clutched her shawl tighter, her eyes fixed on the floor. And when they asked her to testify to confirm what had just happened, she slowly shook her head. "He's still my husband," she whispered. He didn't mean it. Those words cut deeper than any of Thomas's blows. For years I had told myself she was a victim like me, trapped, powerless. But in that moment I faced a harsher truth. She had chosen silence. She had chosen him. And maybe she always would. At the hospital, as they stitched the gash above my eyebrow and wrapped my ribs, Daniel arrived straight from deployment. He stood at my bedside, grief and fury burning in his eyes, his hand gripping mine so tightly I felt the tremor in his bones. "Never again," he said, voice low but steady. "He will never touch you again." The next day Major Reed came with a folder thick with reports. Thomas's arrest wasn't just about one night. It opened a record. Old complaints long ignored, charges once buried, silenced voices finally uncovered. This time the system would not look away. For once, the law carried a weight heavier than Thomas's fists. And yet, beneath the relief I grieved. Not for Thomas, he was nothing but a shadow now, but for my mother who had stood in that corner her entire life, mistaking submission for survival. I realized then that saving her had never been in my power. What I could save was myself. When I stepped out of the hospital days later, my uniform crisp despite the bandages beneath, the air felt different. I was no longer the child whispering promises in the dark. I was a soldier who had survived 2 battlefields, foreign and domestic. And as the flag outside the base snapped in the wind, I finally understood the truth I had been running toward all my life. Freedom was never handed over. It was claimed. The first thing I felt when I woke in the military hospital wasn't the bandages or the throb in my ribs. It was Daniel's hand wrapped firmly around mine, steady and warm. At the other side of the bed stood Rachel, arms crossed, her sharp eyes softer than I had ever seen them. And beside her was Major Reed, holding a folder that seemed to carry the weight of everything I had spent years trying to bury. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't alone. When my mother walked into the room, I braced myself for silence. Instead, her shoulders shook and her words poured out like a dam finally breaking. She confessed what I had always known and yet needed to hear. 15 years of bruises, fear, and choices made in the name of protecting me. She believed that if she stayed quiet, carried the burden herself, Thomas's rage would spare me. But her silence hadn't saved me. It had only pulled me deeper into the fire. Tears blurred her face, but this time she didn't look away. The courtroom was colder than any tent I had ever slept in overseas. Thomas appeared polished, dressed sharp, as if civility itself could erase what he had done. He tried to paint me as unstable, accused me of exaggeration, of betrayal. But the evidence towered against him like a fortress. The SOS signal from my radio, the medical records that documented every fracture, my mother's testimony, all of it formed a wall his lies couldn't scale. When the judge read the sentence, 20 years in federal prison, his military honors stripped, Thomas's mask finally cracked. I didn't see a commander anymore, not even a man, only the hollow fury of someone who had lost control for the last time. Out of that wreckage I chose to build. Alongside Rachel, I founded Shield of Valor, an organization dedicated to connecting service members and families living under the shadow of domestic violence. Daniel took charge of logistics, making sure no cry for help would ever meet silence again. And my mother, hesitant but determined, began volunteering at the Veterans Hospital. Slowly her voice returned. The first time she sang the national anthem at a parade, her voice strong and unwavering, I felt a circle close. Months later, standing before a hall of military doctors and cadets, I spoke words I once thought I could never say aloud. Silence never protected anyone. We are only safe when we have the courage to tell the truth. The applause rose around me, but I didn't need it. What mattered was the stillness inside, the knowledge that the war I had carried for decades was no longer mine alone. I had spoken, and in that truth I had finally claimed my freedom. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share how it made you feel in the comments and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Your words and presence mean more than you know. Don't forget to hit subscribe to The Revenge Story so you won't miss the next story that might reach your heart. Let's keep this conversation alive.